From the intersection of 218 and 80, with the rivers like our own that seek for seas they never find. I'm Aaron McNally, and this is Curiosity Now.
All right, so Curiosity Now listeners, we're sitting here with Matt Lewis, who, in addition to being a senior columnist for the Daily Beast, has also written for the Daily Caller and The Week and has appeared on places such as CNN and MSNBC. He's also the host of an excellent podcast, Matt Lewis and the News, always a host of many interesting and intelligent guests, and somewhat weekly appears alongside Bill Scher of Politico on the Blogging Heads show, The DMZ. He's the author of the not too long ago released book, Too Dumb to Fail, How the GOP Went from the Party of Reagan to the Party of Trump. Matt, thank you very much for your time. Welcome to Curiosity Now.
Hey, Aaron, thanks for having me.
So I just want to get started off. I was not going to start our conversation this way, but I feel I would be amiss were I not to mention it. But today, the great Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias has transcended this material form. I know I saw you post about that this morning, and he has been on your podcast. I've seen him on several online lectures. What do you think that Ravi, let me rephrase this. How did Ravi affect you and your thinking in particular? And how do you think that he affected and shaped conservatism in North America?
Oh, that's a good question. I wish I was more of an expert of him, believe it or not. I really am not. I grew up, in a Christian household that wasn't an intellectual Christian household. So I grew up probably more influenced by, the Billy Grahams of the world and maybe even, televangelists than Christian apologists. But I had interviewed Michael Weir, who was the faith-based initiatives outreach guy for Obama. And Michael and I are friends, and I had just had him on my podcast. And he mentioned that Ravi was coming to town and would I want to interview him. And so this really just fell into my lap. This isn't someone that I'd been pining to interview. But once I mentioned him to other people that I knew and respected, they were really excited about it. And so I kind of went to school and read up on him. And we had a really good conversation about his life, about his beliefs, and we even did get into politics. And now I look back, he just was diagnosed with cancer like 2 months ago. And so this happened really quickly, the end. I think he was in his early 70s, so he wasn't super old either. For me, it was more a feeling of like, wow, I'm really blessed that I had a chance to talk to him when I did. But in terms of kind of eulogizing him, I'm actually not prepared to fully do that.
Sure, totally understandable. You did bring up a key word, intellectual. And for anybody who does want to check out his work, you should definitely check it out on YouTube. He is, we've called him an apologist, which simply means that he's willing to explain the Christian faith in a way that makes it relevant to whatever cultural setting he finds himself in. And he's known for, and he exemplifies in his videos, definitely an intellectually astute mind that is completely unafraid to deal with any kind of scientific or scientistic arguments against faith in God. He's very sharp-witted, well-spoken, and sharp-minded. And I'm glad that word intellectual came up in your response, Matt, because I actually had your book queued up here. I wanted to, just early in the book, you take the time to define the word intellectual for the purposes of your book. And the word does appear throughout your book. This is how you defined it there. In my mind, the word refers to a learned person who thinks about big ideas, endeavors to study history and philosophy, and engages in critical thought and reflection. So you said this in the context of an introduction to a book that sort of analyzes and assesses the trajectory of the Republican Party, mostly from Reagan to the age of Trump, though you do get into some history before that. You seem to think that the term has value and merit, both at the level of establishing and articulating one's political philosophy, but also assumedly in the implementation of policymaking. Now, there's been much ado in the past few years, political discourse, I think probably starting really pronouncedly with the rhetoric of the Tea Party, this sort of anti-elite kind of rhetoric. How do you distinguish having a sound, healthy intellectualism from being run by the quote-unquote elites?
Right. And that's why I wanted to define that, because I think that, one man's sort of intellectual is another man's pointy-headed, snobby elite. So I wanted to really define those two things, because, the premise of the book, or one of the main themes of the book, is that the Republican Party and the conservative movement have become dumbed down over recent years. And while, look, I think it's perfectly fine to say the experts don't have all the answers, I think it's pretty unhealthy to discount experts and wisdom and knowledge. And so what I was trying to do is find a way to talk about intellectuals, people like Ravi Zacharias, in fact, that portrays them not with the negative connotation that the word, I think, is, that some people have come to associate with the word intellectual.
Absolutely. And it seems to me that to have a healthy republic, you want to actually have conversations between the educated and the uneducated, the literate and the illiterate. And you simply can't do that if you have people pigeonholed into stereotypes.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I want to encourage is for more people to become intellectuals, in the sense of people who take ideas seriously, and people who try to read and talk to other people to learn. Not necessarily that everyone is going to become an academic, but that people can take ideas seriously, and I think that is healthy for the republic.
So this gets into the original question I was thinking about starting a conversation off with, and that's that I had a question that I kind of think is an academic question, but which is one that I still wanted to ask nevertheless. My favorite poet is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and anybody who's familiar with Curiosity Now probably already knows that. And Sam Coleridge wrote a series of sonnets to eminent characters that he would publish in weekly newspapers back in the day when poems were published in newspapers. That was a thing. Look it up. Mm-hmm. All of his sonnets to eminent characters were typically homages and sort of exalted these people. There were only two that he wrote that were actually critical. And one of them was the one written for Edmund Burke, who is a sort of intellectual hero of the conservative movement. Now, it's interesting because I would like to say that Coleridge was arguing with Burke over Burke's decision to not speak favorably of the French Revolution, but that's not why. He actually was critical of Burke because he claimed that he risked corruption because Burke had accepted a government pension, which is an interesting little distinction. And I'm not much of a historian myself, and I am kind of curious about how that all fit into Burke's philosophy and biography. But anyway, setting that aside, I mean, you can talk about it if you want to. What do you think about Burke's more favorable attitude toward the American Revolution as opposed to the French Revolution? And how does that speak to the essence of conservatism in your mind?
Well, look, I think it's very important. The American Revolution, there were certainly a lot of American revolutionaries who wanted this to be a global trend. People like, you know, Thomas Jefferson among them, right? And so there was a sense that the American Revolution maybe kicked off this trend where we would free ourselves from the shackles of monarchy. But they're very different things, of course. For one thing, you know, the Americans had been engaging in some form of self-rule for a long time. They didn't kill the king. They didn't overthrow the church, and they didn't try to basically create a new world, make the world over again. And so the American Revolution was as conservative of a revolution as you could possibly have. And the French Revolution, you know, I think, you know, metastasized into something pretty ugly. And so it is interesting that Burke was for the American Revolution ostensibly, or at least was pretty much pro-American in Parliament, but was vehemently opposed to the French Revolution. And I think it is a big distinction. And I think that if you look at, you know, in my book, and there's a lot of different ways to tell the story of how the left and the right are different. And I don't claim that mine is the definitive story. But I really hearken to Yuval Levin's book about Paine and Burke. It's called The Great Debate. And basically how these two worldviews that we still have today that we call the left and the right kind of go back to that era, to that French Revolution. And you know, I think the ideas of the French Revolution in some ways come from a worldview that believes that man was inherently good, that would suggest that you could actually have the perfectibility of mankind. And that is at odds with a conservative philosophy that says we live in a fallen world and that we're really kind of blessed that we have civilization, that, you know, we are fighting against our carnal fleshly side all the time. Man was not perfect and is not perfectible. Man is fallen, but we create institutions and civilization and manners in order to basically make the best of things and get by. And so those are two very, very different philosophies. But I do think if you follow it out until the 21st century, there are still those worldviews do still inform and influence modern conservatism, which is a little bit messy to talk about because I don't want to confuse that with Trumpism. But modern conservatism and modern sort of things that progressives believe, you could go back to that those differences that I talked about as a beginning of you know, maybe not even the beginning, but certainly like a microcosm of where we've become.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to ask you at some point during this conversation, you know, a big question in how you use terms is whether Trump is a conservative or not, right? And by your standards, I'm thinking probably no. Is that correct?
That's right. It gets messy. It gets to become involved in semantics even. But my definition of an American conservative, because I think that an American conservative is different even from a European conservative, right? So Burke was born in Ireland, a British parliamentarian. And I do think that he is the father of modern conservatism. But having said that, I think that American conservatism is still a little different from European conservatism. And American conservatism is seeking to conserve a classical liberal political philosophy. So in a sense, we're preserving liberalism, you know, small l, lowercase l, liberalism. So we're not trying to preserve the monarchy because we never had a monarchy. We are trying to preserve the American Revolution, the spirit of 76. And those things involve, you know, ideas about, political, classical liberal ideas about institutions and the rule of law and tolerance and all sorts of things that Donald Trump doesn't really seem that fond of. So I would argue, and it's not just because I don't think Donald Trump is really pro-life, but it's even deeper than that. I would argue Donald Trump isn't really a conservative. Now, this all becomes semantics, right? And you could at some point argue, well, conservatism is what conservatives say it is, and conservatism, and so maybe he's the real conservative and I'm not, right? I mean, we could play that game, but in my mind, it's the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's another semantic distinction that I'll just mention in passing, and we talk about classical liberalism. Our form of republic, our constitutional democracy. That's not the same thing. Sometimes classical liberalism is said to be sort of a more highbrow way of saying libertarian, which some of the finer varieties of libertarian, that may be true, but it's not something that I would say that someone from the Libertarian Party necessarily is a classical liberal by my standard. The reason I bring this up,
I think I was going to say, I think in terms of economics, they're very consistent with libertarian. The sort of maybe like even the Austrian economic stuff that a lot of libertarians aspire to would very much fit into the classical liberalism, but capital L, like Libertarian Party, like means a lot more than just that.
Yeah, right. No, the only reason I brought that up is because I live in a very quote unquote liberal college town, university town, and it was actually in a relationship I had with a woman that I started wondering, geez, am I a conservative? I would just have positions on issues where I would suddenly, in contrast to just a sort of progressivism that didn't seem particularly interested in the Constitution, it just suddenly seemed like I was conservative. And the thing that made me really interested in it as a topic was George Will put out a book last year. I believe it's called the Conservative Sensibility. Is that right? Is that what it's called?
I think so.
Yeah.
He was on this he was on my podcast. He was on my podcast to talk about it, but even I have a hard time remembering all these titles.
I bring it up because I heard him there, and I heard him talk to Jonah Goldberg, and I heard him talk to Ben Shapiro. I actually listened to a lot of interviews with him at that time. The thing that got me interested in conservatism as a topic was George Will said, as Trump was ascending in the party, I can't remember which interview or if there was multiple interviews where he said something about Paul Ryan deciding to endorse Trump was like the straw that broke the camel's back for him. And what he said was, as far as I could tell, the Republican Party was no longer interested in the Constitution. Now, I'm not exactly sure how the policy and politics work with respect to that, but hearing somebody say I'm breaking with the party over a constitutional sensibility, that really resonated with me, and my ear was definitely turned. Did that resonate with you at all? I know you've been characterized as a quote unquote, what is it, a human scum or whatever it is.
Yeah, look, I mean, I am very worried about losing what this precious thing we have. Jonah Goldberg, his last book, I think did a great job of talking about this miracle, like the fact that I can talk to you on Zoom or on Skype is a technological miracle. But the fact that there aren't gangs of thugs beating me and raping me right now is probably an even bigger miracle. Like, we live in a very dangerous world, and we have created over thousands of years, millions of years, we've created a civilization. We've created norms. We've created a country over the last couple of hundred years that protects us and gives us what Burke called ordered liberty, right? It's that fine line. You need both of those things. You need order, because if you don't have order, gangs of your neighbor will kill you and take your house, right? But if you don't have liberty, the government will kill you and take your house. So you have to have ordered liberty. And so that's part of what being a conservative is about to me. I'm very worried about preserving this tenuous, beautiful, amazing miracle, as Jonah Goldberg calls it, that we have. And I think it's worth fighting for. And I think that involves our God-given, freedoms, as the Declaration talks about. I think it involves making sure that we have that the Constitution is followed, and that we are also following norms that are not like statutorily spelled out. Like, all of those things are super important, and I'm really interested in that and keyed in on that. And I think that's part of what really does bother me about Trump is I don't think he has that deep reverence for all of these things that I just talked about.
Absolutely. It seems like
oh, by the way, I'm sorry to interrupt, but before I forget, I think that part of my guess is that part of what happened to you with this relationship is what I've seen happen to a lot of people, which is you might have been like an old-fashioned liberal, and old-fashioned liberals believed in things like tolerance and free speech. And a lot of the new progressives are really post-liberal, they remind me of the alt-right. Actually, they don't really want to say like, hey man, that's your opinion, but I differ, or like, everyone has a right, I'll fight. I may not agree with you, but I'll fight for your right to say it. Like, they don't really subscribe to that. And those are like liberal values, like classical liberal values that I believe in.
Yeah.
That I
fair
want to
enough.
conserve as a conservative.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's been this tendency to attempt to boycott types of speech that are seen as somehow contradicting specific groups' values, or somehow threaten them. And because of that kind of impetus, there's this sort of fury that people of values that they found discordant should have access to the public sphere in any way. There's sort of outrage culture. It's really been a very turbulent time. Do you think Trump, this is off of my original arc, but do you think Trump is a cause or a symptom of that?
Oh, I think he's much more a symptom. Like, a healthy democracy doesn't elect a Donald Trump. It just doesn't. Right.
Sure.
I think there's just so many factors that I spell out in my book, but one of them is just like the reality TV culture, that we end up with. You don't get Trump without reality TV and without Twitter. So I think technology and the bread and circuses thing has led to it. And then I do think some of it actually are our elites. I think that although I'm really against the anti-intellectualism and the anti-elitism that we have today in today's populism, there is some truth to it, in the sense that I think if elites are competent and credible and earning our respect, they're not as susceptible to this hostile takeover. So there's a lot. Trump does cause some problems, but I think he is more the manifestation of a lot of problems that have been building up for years.
Yeah, that seems like an accurate assessment, as so many of your assessments are, Matt Lewis. So yeah, one thing I've been listening to, so we're talking about the Burkean conservatism and this idea that our ordered society emerges gradually through trial and error through a long period of time. Institutions emerge and are built, and these institutions are able to sort of keep order in the midst of what otherwise could very easily be a rape and pillage kind of chaos. But nevertheless, institutions are, and this is part of the liberty aspect of your analysis. Institutions do also foster corruption, right? So, and they can sometimes just be sort of, because out of necessity, they need to be generic enough to serve adequately a vibrant and diverse populace, they allow for a great amount of disagreement with them, and sometimes certain groups might legitimately have rights that are not treated with respect by the institution, depending on whatever cultural group is in power at the time. So naturally, as a response to that capability for corruption and for monopolization of power, there does need to be bloodless revolution. And that's why we have a democracy. That's why we have representatives that are able to be voted out every so often, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me that given those assumptions that go into the way that the Constitution was framed and the way we think about it, in a certain sense, conservatism is somewhat dependent upon progressivism and vice versa. You can't want to progress and improve things without thinking that there's something to improve, some kind of foundational institution. And you can't have a foundational institution without having some kind of mechanism that allows for hopefully civil protest. Does that seem accurate to you?
Yeah, absolutely. In a way, I feel like it's almost like the Yankees need the Red Sox, you know? I feel like America's been well served actually by having these two great ideas that have been in tension. And sometimes, as in the case of civil rights, liberals are right. And sometimes, as in the case of the Soviet Union, I think conservatives have been right. But they keep each other in check. They guard each other from kind of overreaching and their worst impulses. And both sides have bad impulses sometimes, certainly the fringes of both sides. So I think it's been healthy that we've had this back and forth tension by and large. I think that, you mentioned elections, a way to have a kind of a bloodless revolution every so often. I think that's certainly healthy. I think the fact that America has, the promissory note that all men are created equal and we have equal protection under the law, that certainly is important to making sure that that people who are not part of the ruling class have rights, and if they're being deprived, they have the moral high ground and the statutory ability to make their case, to try to change things. I think, Burke was a believer in reform. He didn't believe in no change. He believed in kind of evolutionary change. And he was again pretty positive toward the American Revolution. So I think it's a mistake to think that conservatism is completely like hidebound and tied to the past. I think it's trying to conserve those good things about our founding. I think it's cautious and sometimes maybe overly cautious, but because we are protecting this very precious miracle, I think it is cautious. But I also think that change has to happen. If nothing else, technology is going to drive change. Even if everything else were to be stagnant, you're going to have to change as a result of technology. And so the question is, do you do it cautiously? Do you do it wisely? Do you do it prudently? And that's kind of what I'm for. I don't think I mean, there are people on both sides of the aisle who are just evil, horrible people that I certainly would not want to be governed by. But I think by and large, we've benefited by having the push and pull of these two ideologies in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something going back to that classical liberal thing where, you asserted that I had possessed some qualities of just an old school liberal. And I had made the assumption in my head, or the association rather, between that and conservatism in some respect. And the thought occurred to me several times reading your book that conservatism is actually very useful for liberals. I wondered what you thought about that, if that's an accurate assessment or not.
Yeah, I think if you are the kind of liberal who believes in things like free speech and tolerance and the rule of law, then it is. And so I've taken, in order to avoid confusion, we were talking about the semantic argument. I have quit referring, well, I hate to say I've quit. I'm trying to wean myself. I'm trying to quit using the word liberal with a negative connotation. And I'm trying to instead talk about the left or progressives. And I don't even know if the progressives thing is fair. It's probably more fair to say the left. So to me, the left is anti-liberal or post-liberal in America today. But liberals are people, we may disagree about the tax rate, right? Like I may think taxes are too high. Liberals may think taxes are too low. I may focus on the right to life and think, focus on that. They may say abortion's bad, but we have this right to choose and privacy. We may disagree about some very serious things, but I think I can disagree with a liberal and go out and have a beer and kind of agree to disagree. And you could be certainly be an honest, decent, great person and be a liberal. The left, I think, is maybe a different story.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's such a, the thing that happens with that phrase is even that one gets kind of, you never really know exactly what a person's actual economic philosophy is. They might just think that universal health care is a potential reality that wouldn't be as bad as some people fear it might.
Yeah.
At the systemic level. That's hardly like a sort of Lenin
so much
Marx.
Of it speaks
to
me. Well, to me, a lot of it speaks to motives, and it speaks to, does the end justify the means too? Like, what are your motives? Do you love this country and just sincerely believe that the idea I think is crazy is good? But if you truly love the country and you think it's best, that's fine. And the other question is, what are you willing to do to achieve that, right? Like, if you believe, that we should have universal health care and we just need to persuade enough people to agree to that and to vote for it, that's entirely different than if you want to like murder people who disagree. And
Sure.
So that speaks to like how radical and revolutionary a person is.
Yeah, absolutely. And this got kind of brought up by the IDW and Jordan Peterson a lot in the last couple of years. This idea that, hey, we do need to remember that some significant human slaughter happened in the 20th century because of political ideology and ideas that could have been argued to have been, consistent with the idea of being able to perfect a society. And it's a very real threat that we shouldn't undervalue.
Oh yeah. Everybody talks about, not everybody, but people who don't like religion talk about the Crusades and how many people were killed in the name of God or in the name of religion. There's a lot of people killed by atheist ideologues too, probably more, certainly in the 20th century. I mean, Joseph Stalin alone has a pretty good body count.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of body counts, no, I'm just I was going to talk about Ice-T's hardcore band, but did that cultural reference go past you?
I'm not. Is this the gangster rap thing? Yeah, I did just listen to the Tupac and Biggie podcast that was.
Oh, the Slow Burn, Malcolm Gladwell. Oh, I have yet to check that out, but I hear nothing but rave reviews about it.
The best season was the Bill Clinton season, which I highly recommend. The Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton,
sure,
Linda Tripp actually called in and talked to the host, and it was, it's definitely worth listening to.
I might have to check that out. That's not related. I mean, that's not unrelated to, your remark earlier that, Trump is a symptom of a much longer political history than we want to recognize sometimes. There's been a couple decades of.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Bill Clinton's actions paved the way for Trump in some ways. Bill Clinton normalized some of this behavior. Mm-hmm. And I also think that there were conservatives, and I don't think this is right of them, but I think they felt like, okay, Bill Clinton did this and he got away with it and he actually became more popular. Therefore, let's drop our standards when we get our guy in office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Like, to me, that's not, like, two wrongs don't make a right, but that's, I think, how some people felt.
Well, maybe two wrongs make a cultural vacuum. And hopefully in the 0 hour, we can redefine our civilization and values.
I definitely think two wrongs make a trend. So,
well, and there's been a whole, I could get on a big tangent, but there has been a whole reckoning. I mean, with the whole Me Too movement and everything, and which, it's interesting the ways in which the Me Too movement are actually, you might not assume right off the bat, but they're very consistent with some of the cultural and Christian conservative stuff. I mean, the idea that you should be an upright person and behave properly, that you should have a sense of values, that treat all humans with respect, that you shouldn't allow your sexuality to have such a place in your life that, you somehow need to channel that.
The big one to me is not sexy, but it's, if you have power, you shouldn't exploit that power over people who don't have as much power. That's the big Christian value that I think really tracks with Me Too, right? Because you're the president, you have a lot more power than an intern, And so to me, or if you're Harvey Weinstein and you're about to greenlight a movie or hire an actress, you have power over somebody. And so the question is, back in the old days, you watch like an old 50s or 60s movie or TV show, and they talk about, like, don't, quote, take advantage of her, or you're not going to take advantage of her, are you? Like, that terminology is actually very apt. Take advantage, and that's what it is, I think. And I think ultimately it's about power. I mean, Christianity worships a dude who allowed himself to be hung on a cross when he could have summoned down angels to vanquish and destroy everybody else. And he's a sacrificial savior. It's servant leadership. Donald Trump doesn't believe in sacrificial leadership. He puts himself on a pedestal, not on the cross. Mm-hmm. And so I think that you're right, though. It's the feminists who advocate Me Too and the social conservatives who are all about abstinence or whatever have a lot in common. Mm-hmm. And but they just don't want to admit, at least the feminists don't want to admit to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonah Goldberg quipped, that there's actually something he said there's a Puritan strand in United States culture that he kind of likes. And the Me Too movement definitely exemplifies some of that Puritan strand. There's no doubt about it.
And, and if you go back in history, it was women who led the temperance movement, mm-hmm. Who were behind some of the social gospel stuff. And so there is there used to be, they used to be connected, where you would have the kind of the social gospel Christian church involved with, women's rights, including, banning alcohol, things like that. But that coalition, and there have been times over like issues like pornography and stuff, and like where they've kind of come together. In fact, if you listen to that that Slow Burn podcast about Biggie and Tupac, there's even a reference to it. I think that there was as I recall, there was a black pastor who was against the hip hop, 90s hip hop and rap, gangster rap music, partly because of the depiction of women, like in the videos and the verbiage about women. So every once in a while, those stars align, but not much.
Yeah, there's a African American radio show or radio station in my hometown of Waterloo, Iowa, that never allowed hip hop as programming on their broadcasting, for that very reason, for the slippage of values that were too often portrayed within the message of those types of music at the time. I think they might actually allow it now, but it took them a good 20 years before they allowed hip hop on a black station, which is really saying something. So I just want to get back to this one point, I guess, for a final question. I'd mentioned, that the idea of conserving the most relevant aspects the most important, most precious aspects of our democracy is a conservative idea, to conserve that, and how that plays into the lives of liberals as well as the lives of conservatives. And do you see how the words, they get all mixed up?
It's confusing, but I think it's totally right. I mean, look, if part of the problem with like progressivism is they want to keep progressing. Mm-hmm. I mean, when does it end, right? Like, if you're trying to drive to St. Louis and you're leaving Washington, D.C., for a long ways, the answer is keep going west. Yeah. But at some point, if you keep going west, you'll end up in California, right? So, I mean, the answer isn't always to keep going left.
Sure.
If you believe that there's a Goldilocks kind of sweet spot where this is now, we finally have enough tolerance now. We finally have enough, free expression or whatever anymore, and civilization's going to topple over.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. The question I wanted to get to is more of this issue with semantics that we were struggling with. You famously had George Will at least publicly say he wasn't a Republican anymore, which, I mean, how much of that is an editorialism that puts him on a position for the sake of making an argument? We have yet to see. It depends on who the Republican candidates are in the next elections, But Jonah Goldberg kind of famously, says because of where he lives, maybe he votes for Republican, maybe he doesn't. He's more of a ideological conservative at the abstract intellectual level. I get the reason I'm asking the question is I do wonder to what extent party is essential to conservatism. Can a conservative be a Democrat or some other party? You've kicked around in some conversations with Bill Scher. Well, let's see if the libertarians run the Samash. What would I do then? What are your thoughts about whether the essence of the philosophy is tied to partisan politics?
Oh yeah, I think it has nothing to do with political party at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that for most of my lifetime, the conservative movement and the Republican Party were very simpatico. I mean, but even that was a fairly, that wasn't always the case. I mean, from like 1980 until 2016, that existed. I think those two overlapped tremendously. But I don't think conservatism needs a Republican Party. And I think that for me, conservatism is a worldview, a philosophy, a temperament. It's not a political party, but it does inform the way that you view politics, certainly. But there's nothing magical about the elephant or the word Republican. You could certainly imagine a scenario where the Democratic Party has been at times and could be, again, more conservative. And I think you could even make the argument one could make the argument, I'm not saying I agree with it, but one could make the argument that Joe Biden is more of a conservative, or Barack Obama is more of a conservative than Donald Trump, who himself is very radical, and I would argue, and by my definition, very unconservative.
He's certainly very sort of monarchical.
Yes, which is what confuses it, right? Because if you go back to European conservatism, they're conserving the monarchy. If you go back to the French Revolution, the right and the left come from where they sat and how they wanted to handle monarchy, essentially, was the dividing line.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I got to thank you again for spending time with me, man. It's been a great chat.
This has been good for me. I have to say, I wrote the book. The book came out in January 2016, which means I basically wrote it in 2015, turned it in. So it's been about 5 years. And I love talking about this stuff, but it's rare. So this has been challenging my brain and stretching me, because I end up talking about current events all the time, and I rarely get to exercise these muscles. So this has been very good.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to have been a part of that. And sometime maybe we can get together again. We'll talk about Reagan. I got a lot of questions to ask you about Reagan.
I'm always happy. I'd love to talk about Reagan. So let me know. We'll make it happen.